Hello and welcome back to this last session of our 4-day program. Basically, it's a discussion session over about the entire program, the Cinema and Revolution part, and what we have been discussing today in the contra aesthetics workshop. So we have titled it as a kind of a summing up of the central problem that we are trying to deal with in these last 4 days. Something like so it's titled between aestheticization of politics and the autonomy of the aesthetic process. Something which Vibhuti will initiate in her inaugural discussion. So Vibhuti Sharma is an independent researcher who completed her PhD in Theatre and Performance Studies from the School of Arts and Aesthetics. Her PhD, which she submitted in 2016, was titled Bhatkhande and the Nature of Abstraction, Critique of Scientific Consciousness, which basically explores the development and the limits of artistic consciousness in the context of Hindustani classical music. So I hand it over to Vibhuti.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Shaumik. What should I say? I don't know, because after Anubhav's really complex and sophisticated formulations and fascinating presentations by Anubhav and Vaibhav and Sayeed in the morning, I'm in a very difficult position now, and thanks to, of course, Shaumik. Because if being an initiator means having a meta position to the theme of discussion and the interlocutors, then that is definitely not the case here. Today, I'm in no meta position with regard to anything, and it's actually a very strange feeling to be in this role. So I'll still try to turn this around a bit. I was only expected to present a paper in the workshop today, but due to paucity of time, I have been unable to work out a sustained argument with regard to what I had been reading. So what I will do is begin by putting forth some of ideas as very fragmented points with much hesitation and place these as problems for our larger question on the relationship between art, politics and philosophy. So I have these points written down. I don't think I'll take much time, and maybe from there I'll read this out, and from there we can open the session for discussion. In the debate between music and philosophy, the German composer Richard Wagner occupies a crucial and controversial position in the history of Western music. The issue of Wagner and his oeuvre in the debates from 19th century onwards can be looked at either in the light of the specific aesthetic question as to how does Wagner become important as a composer in forging a link between music and philosophy. That is, what does he signify that brings philosophy to reflect on its musical condition? What in Wagner provokes the question of a possibility or not of a relation between music and philosophy? On the other hand, major debates on Wagner foreground his anti-Semitism and his relation with Nazism, the politics of Beirut during National Socialism, and Wagner's relation with Hitler and so forth, thereby introducing the problem of politics and ideology with regard to music, which complicates the question of pleasure of art as it gets diluted or rather completely sublated in the political associations of the artwork. Thus, alongside the aesthetic philosophical question that I pointed out earlier, the problem of Wagnerism is always a political problem, political question in a large number of debates around Richard Wagner. So to begin with the latter, what is this political problem? Now, an essential feature of Wagner's opera is argued to be the synthesis that it forges between its narrative, poetic, and musical structure. The grand scale and majesty of his operas is attributed to his ambition of uniting the individual arts into what he calls a total work of art. I don't know if I'll be able to pronounce it properly, but the German word is Gesamtkunstwerk, which stands at the very end of art as the accomplishment of dramatic art par excellence. So it is in the unification of all the arts such as poetry, music, and drama that Wagner constructs his operas. He was constructing a work of art that pushed each individual art to its maximum limit, where it extends into the other art form under the imperative of realizing its maximum power of expression. So this was a point of major debate when his opera was I'm forgetting which one, but was performed in France, because the poet Baudelaire and Philippe Lacoue-Labat, who takes up this issue of Wagner as a political problem, he shows how the French poets Baudelaire and Mallarmé responded to this question of Wagner's operas challenging the supremacy of poetry, somewhere threatening the power of poetry through the majesty of his own opera, which kind of sublated, which kind of unified all the individual arts. This was, according to Wagner, the greatest aspiration of the artist, this sort of a unification of a collective artwork. Now, where the individual, artwork where the individual places of the arts, he could conceive a total artwork that would rise to the world and hold a prophetic mirror to the future. Thus, a music of the future, he says, Zukunftsmusik, as one of his treatises was titled. He writes, and I quote, "Not one rich faculty of the separate arts will remain unused in the united artwork of the future. In it will each attain its first complete appraisement." Unquote. And this artwork cannot serve the need of an individual man. Instead, in order to be a true need, it can only be such when it is experienced by the community as a whole, he writes, by people as a whole. Hence, he talks of the unit man, and this is the phrase that he uses, who, through his evolution, carries the essence of the human species. So the unit man can be understood as the smallest unit, akin to a cellular unit that carries the possibility of totalization in Wagner's systematic construction of operas. Now, philosophers like Lacoue-Labat, as I mentioned, anticipate in the totalizing aesthetics of Wagner the totalitarian politics of the 20th century. He argues that Wagner's music serves the ideological function by giving a form, a model for constituting politics, as long as all politics involves configuring a people, thereby staging the political function of aesthetics. Now, this is not the question, he clarifies, of a politics of art, but drawing from Benjamin and Brecht an aestheticization of the political. The political model of National Socialism is realized in the idea of the total artwork, the Gesamtkunstwerk. Foregrounding the idea, there are a lot of, is a popular theme of by the ideologues of the Nazi regime. So a favorite theme of Dr. Goebbels was that the idea of politics as the plastic art of the state. So the German state seeks to constitute itself as a work of art. So Bayreuth, where Wagner built his opera house, according to Lacoue-Labat, gives the model to the people of the state to represent themselves. The Gesamtkunstwerk thus is a political project. This idea of the polis as a work of art, explains Lacoue-Labat, does not imply that the truth of the city, of the political, is in the artwork, but that the political ground itself, it belongs to the sphere of art. So the argument goes that the totalization in Wagnerian operas is at the service of producing an idea of the nation, of fashioning a German destiny. Now in Wagner, the idea of a total work of art is achieved through the synthesis of various techniques and motives. Central to the debates on Wagner is his use of myths. that is, of using a mythological form of representation. So, in his operas such as The Ring Cycle, The Master Singer's Parsifal, and so on the basis of his reading of German legends and Norse mythology, he constructs or formalizes a norm of presentation or imitation, which many argue, in line with his conservative revolutionism, creates a new mythology, a mythology of the new German nation. But what is the role of this myth, of myth in the aestheticization of the political, in the conceptualization of political as a work of art? The myths, according to Lakulabad, effectuate an identification according to which people can organize themselves. Myths configure, not in the sense of a false invention, but in the sense of a figuration. And figuration is the word that he uses, of a type which provides a model for identity, and which is also that identity as such. So, more than being mythological, myth is read as the power of an embodied identity, the power to orient people towards an identity, towards a synthesis, as it were. So, myth in the service of identity. Now, Lakulabad reveals this teleology of art, which is in the service of imposing a mythology. Myths accomplish the necessity of having a figure for organizing the community of the nation. Hence, fiction of politics. Fiction in the sense of figuring, of producing a figure that would encapsulate the essence of the political and give the political its identity. The artwork, in its idea of a united or collected artwork, reveals the concept of the nation, its people. So myths serve a rhetorical function in persuading the value of the German nation. The myth operates as a rhetorical tool to emphasize a specific political idea of the nation. A politics which names its truth, that of the German nation, which will take on a particular name of the Aryan race. Thus, myths are self-referential units which, delimited in the specific figuring of the Aryan race, finds its truth in the people, and the people find their verification in the figure that is presented. The political desire is thus immediately realized in the particular name Aryan. The function of the myth is to serve the purpose of immediately effectuating this essence of the people. Hence, a will to immediacy is localized in the use of myth, which embodies and provides the truth of the closed system of the German nation. Thus, in the triangulation that Schomburg proposed of art, politics, and philosophy, I am introducing here the problem of myth through Wagner. Now, in a second move, I'm going to shift, make a major shift here, and introduce a different problem to this triangulation from the context of Hindustani music, and propose a comparative thesis, which is basically a wager. And I haven't developed this idea yet, but I'm interested to try this out. Try out this comparison of the Wagnerian sequence of music with the sequence extracted from the history of North Indian classical music. But unlike the totalizing gesture in Wagner, which moves towards a totalitarian political consciousness, here it might be argued that such a totalization of Hindustani music effectuates what we call a democratic consciousness, and I'm using these words very loosely here. Now, this is a sequence inaugurated by the works of musicologist Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande in the first half of the 20th century in Maharashtra. Now, again, unlike Wagner, where there is a particular use of fiction to produce the nation as a work of art and thereby achieve an aestheticization of the political, here the sequence is quite different. With Bhatkhande, we find a certain use of a scientific logic to produce a totalizing principle of music, of categorizing and organizing Hindustani music. Now, Bhatkhande achieves this through what I call, borrowed from Louis Althusser, principle of abstraction, a way of extracting something like an essence, a central core, a fixed point around which the whole of Hindustani music can be organized. Now, this standardization, which leads to a scientific totalization of Hindustani music, and we can take this up in discussion. I won't demonstrate it here in detail. was achieved through creating a number of binaries, the chief among them being a certain hierarchical binary between theory and practice. So, and in fact, I was thinking about this, Vaibhav, in the morning when you were also talking about this theory and practice question. So, Bhatkhande talks about how there's a dilution of theory in the scene of North Indian Hindustani music because of the illiteracy of the Muslim artists. So, and though you talked about it as, I mean, you said that this, when you were talking about this theorization as a anti-Brahminical will, so to speak, some sort of an anti-Brahminical. No, you said it was a Brahminical gesture of not taking theory seriously. Yeah. So, I mean, if I look at the problem in Bhatkhande, it is actually it's the opposite. Because it is, this will to theoreticism is actually a Brahminical will. And so, very briefly, so Bhatkhande says that there is a dilution of practice, of theory. So there is no link between what is being practiced and there is nothing in the text that provides the proof of the practice. So the ancient sources, he says, the Natya Shastra and Sangeet Ratnakar, they don't satisfy practice. So we need to look for authentic musicological sources which can give the proof of the practice and thereby a theory which can precede this practice. So, however, what is interesting is that apart from the scientific operation of creating a system, Bhatkhande was devoted to the idea of producing a value of science which would carry the truth of Hindustani music. Now, this value was not to be produced scientifically all the time, which is to say that this value was not always generated from within the scientific operation he was mobilizing to totalize Hindustani music. In order to bolster or support this internal generation of a truth value, there was also an effort to produce it elsewhere, namely in tradition. So, an invention of tradition was always at play, which would have a rhetorical function of persuading the reader of the authenticity of the scientific value of understanding music. Hence, Bhatkhande wrote a text enumerating certain scientific principles of music, which was in Sanskrit, under the pseudonym Chatur Pandit, which he would constantly foreground as the authentic text, an authentic ancient musicological source which harmonizes theory and practice, evoking the continuity of a scientific tradition of understanding Hindustani music. Now, this is what can be called a fictionalization of science, which operated as a myth but which was in the service of the scientific concept of Hindustani music. Now, of course, this systematization of music was oriented towards a formal democratization of Hindustani music. So, the totalizing principle that is sought in Hindustani music effectuates not a totalitarian political consciousness but a democratic one. And this is achieved not through an immediate deployment of myth but the indirect deployment of something like the fiction of science. I'm using this idea of democracy also very loosely, but if it comes in discussion, we can talk about it. So, in my research, I tried to show how this scientific fiction of a closed, totalized system of Hindustani music, proposed by Bhatkhande, effectuates itself. Now, instead of highlighting the binary between theory and practice, my work tried to see if the operation of science can be read as a thought practice, instead of the dialectical opposition between theory and practice where the verification of theory can be found in practice and vice versa. But so moving from this dialectical opposition, if we can make basically a movement of a gesture of materialism as a materialist gesture, I use this idea from Althusser, theoretical practice. So idea of this theorization, instead of looking at theory and practice differently, how this will of theorization of theoreticism can be seen as a practice which produces its own excess, its own anomalies. Thus, how to look at Bhatkhande's desire for scientificity, his systematic operations of knowledge, and this materialist gesture is actually to understand if Bhatkhande's desire for scientificity, his systematic operations of knowledge, can be seen as a work of experiment, therefore as a work of risk and hence a creative a creative work. So instead of moving in the logic of science as an order of rule, to move towards an order of creativity, so to speak. Hence, when I pose the problem of music, science, and philosophy, the question of relationship here is not about the scientific appropriation of the artistic singularity or the self-referentiality of art independent of the contingent historical factors. The relationship is more complex where the two are brought together, and yet the relation between them is deferred. They are still put at a distance, but they are still brought together. Now, and I'm going over this very quickly, but I'm going to jump, and this would be a little rough, but to go back to the Wagnerian sequence, like I'm looking for this idea of this creative gesture of science in Bhatkhande. If the problem of totalization in Wagner is also posed, the reading would demand how to move away from this problem of aestheticization of the political function of art towards something of looking at music as an active object. So how music can be the site of raising problems, of testing the hypothesis of nation, if as Dracula sees at work in Wagner, in the domain of music. And here, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but Alibadiu's reading of Wagner in his 5 Lessons of Wagner guides us. I mean, it's an exercise in thinking how we can we can look at this question of art. But I'll quickly just take something that I was reading, and I thought if that can be, if I can put that forth. So, taking the example of one of Wagner's opera, The Master Singers of Nuremberg. This is the only comic opera that Wagner composed. It was based on a story from 16th century, set in the town of Nuremberg. Now, this is the story about master singers who are the traditional singers. They are the custodians of the musical academy of a guild, and the plot revolves around a musical contest that takes place between the singers, between these master singers and another character, Walther, who signifies an innovative singing free from the constraints of rule-bound music tradition of the music academy. So, so we have here two. Wagner shows this problem of tradition of rule-bound singing, and an idea of a singing that kind of seeks to bring a rupture in this formal constitution of music. So in this musical contest, Walther wins, and the master singer, who is the master of the academy guild, suggests that Walther since he has won, he becomes the master singer. Now this is Badiu's reading, and I find this reading very pointed because to question the classic problem of art, of how to synthesize the problem of tradition with innovation. Where does the position of art between this creative genius of rupture, of rules, and the mastery of the tradition, of breaking with tradition lie? Now, Sachs, I don't know how to pronounce this properly, the master singer gives a speech in the end, which is a plea. So basically he has to, in his final speech, he has to resolve this problem of innovation and tradition, and in this speech he gives a plea to forge some sort of a synthesis. And why is this important? He says it. Badiou says it because it brings us to the question of history of art. Now, art's power lies not just in anarchy of rupture, but also in an incorporation of the past. That is, can and should art be posited only in terms of its radical break in its subtraction from past? So, therefore, the question is of how if art exists only in the subtraction, or there is a problem of art's historicity also which has to come into play. So he tries to bring the question of history back into art. So, for grounding the historicity of art, he says that art's power creating by sanctioning that what is innovation. So, art can it can sanction what is innovation only on the basis of what does not exist as innovation. So, innovation exists on the basis of what is not new. So historicity has to be incorporated into the new. So he says, and this is not this is intra-artistic. It is an imminent acknowledgement, a musical acknowledgement of the past vis-a-vis the new. So vis-a-vis the new is art. Art affirms its power, but only in incorporation of of history, and only then can it represent a nation or a people. So, and I'm putting this very briefly, but why I brought this out is that he says that the theme of Germany still remains, because this synthesis, this idea of a German nation as a synthesis of the old and new still remains. But what we can locate here, and Wagner through music tests this problem of tradition and innovation, because the question of Germany here is posed within art. He says that so simultaneously with this problem of the master singer and the innovative singer is the problem of artistic mastery and genius. So, when the master singer makes Walther the master singer, basically when Walther takes his place, he is sacrificing himself to bring the synthesis of the old and new. But in the end, the master singer is hailed as the new master. And so he says that that Sachs, he becomes the master singer only in this last gesture of sacrificing his mastery. So he says, hence artistic processes cannot simply be reduced to genius. They have so I find this interesting, and this is an exercise in reading. And if we are to discuss this question of art and the singularity of the artwork, about how to locate this problem within the music itself, of how to move away from, let's say, if I have to make that move from my earlier idea of an aestheticization of the political function of art, where it's not that, so it is not the point of art having a stake of that there is a political stake in art. No, but what Rakulabad says through this idea of aestheticization is that the political stake is the stake itself. So, and this he says that this is not the totalitarian idea of everything is political, but this idea of the the political function of art is the meaning of art in its highest sense. So, so the effort here is to move away from the theme of aestheticization to test the hypothesis which Wagner's music itself proposes as to the question of German art. So the universality of Germany has to be located in its art, and the effort has to be to look for this in the music. So this is I'm not sure if I'm trying to make this move clearly, but how this idea of the German nation, of the constitution of a people, of the figuring that I talked about, where this logic of a trance, of the idea of a dream of Germany, which is basically to imitate the Greek tragedy. If how the idea of how the function of art should not be reduced to this idea of instituting the idea, of constituting the idea for German nation, but how the idea of the nation has to be found in the music itself, in the art itself. And therefore the question, I mean, from how Badi would put it, was not that the totalization should not take you towards an idea of a German nation, but an idea towards the idea of German art, of art itself. So yeah, the problem of Germany remains, but at least here we are trying to make a move towards the domain of art itself. So yeah, so these are my very vague and fragmented points, but I guess we can open it up.
rupture as the trope of narrativizing art. So in that sense, the rupture, incorporation, connecting that to the second point about German art and not German nation as such, which is a fascinating idea that the universality of Germany is in German art. Interestingly, the question is, what is the name German means here in this context? Obviously, the political idea of Germany and the absence of actual revolution in Germany, or the conservative sort of turn took, just the political history part of it, and so on. And what is generally popularly known as the Sonderweg, or a certain unique German exceptional path and such. Now, how does, and it's more of a question for all of us, that how does one keep the name German away from the temptations of the political appropriations? So in a sense, what are the thresholds of German connected to art and German connected to nation in a geocultural, geopolitical sense? So obviously it is a certain risk, and you're also talking about another risk which Bhatkhande takes, which is science and a certain creative risk as such. So are we saying that, in a sense, by looking at these gestures as risks, as openings, and not as totalizing gestures, can we really rethink such ambitious, enormous projects? And essentially 19th century projects in a certain sense, but yeah.
See, when I'll take the context of Bhatkhande, because when you say that this idea of opening up, that you are saying that this risk of science that you are mentioning,
or rather risk of totalization. I mean, it's a
yeah. See, so the to my mind, the problem of science during Bhatkhande's time, this late 19th, early 20th century, is within the logic of, is read in the logic of modernity. So modernity becomes the necessary cultural logic to look at this scientificity at work, to look at the scientific, this need to give a scientific foundation to Hindustani music. So, so hence now so there is so what this means is basically means that there is an instant appropriation of science to the social context, and of course social political context, because considering that it is the Brahminical logic of theoreticism at work, so it is also a question of power. So, and hence when I move towards kind of gesture towards this other movement, so it is to kind of exaggerate this idea of science, the scientificity, to see how if science itself, if science as such can help us, can become sort of to look at science as a decision. So science is basically the decision of reason that Bhatkhande takes on Hindustani music. So I don't say that Bhatkhande as a figure of modernity, therefore as an already pre-given subject, looks at Hindustani music within the logic of of modernity. So when to increase the stake of science is to localize the problem, localize this decision of science, this decision of reason on Hindustani music, rather than looking at it as a rational decision on Hindustani music. So it's basically it's a decision on reason to give Hindustani music a scientific destiny. So there is in the absolutely localized gesture of this giving of science is also also the universality of all the of giving music a universal value. And so this is why this and in that, how does science does science endanger its stakes? I mean, hence I talk about it, about whether Bhatkhande's systematization can be taken as a risk that he takes. So and again going back to this idea of this decision on science, so which would mean that with the very decision that music has the capacity for being scientific. So, which means that because now he decides that science is capable of music, that we look back and see if there was science, if there was a relationship of science or not. But not that there earlier was science, and hence now we have to again bring back, it has been diluted by the Muslim artists, and now we have to again bring back the question of a scientific foundation. I mean, I hope I'm trying to, yeah. So, yeah.
Because, I mean, it reminds me of another enormous enterprise undertaken by a contemporary of Bhatkhande, Vishwanath Kashinath Rajwadi. So, of a Hegelian ambition that of basically creating history as an edifice upon which the new community or a nation to come would be imagined. And on the one hand, it may appear a very positivist enterprise of accumulating evidence and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, the philosophical ambition is to trace a certain continuity of spirit, which uninterruptedly moves through, despite the external sort of invasions and impurifications and so on and so forth. So in a sense, yeah, I see what you mean, that these are certain acts which, and a very fascinating piece he writes, they're called Kadambari. And a very interesting reading of that by Milind Wakankar, which I'm referring to here. So in that essay, he says, and it may appear from the title that he's going to talk about a genre called novel. But he says, no, I'm not going to talk about that. So the question is not whether we had a novel and not, so whether novel is European and we are imitating. He's not interested in that problem. He goes to the very question of fantasy and fiction. And he says fiction is the very condition for anything to exist. And then he goes to mathematics and starts looking at certain axiomatic decisions in the history of mathematics as fictions. So it is that kind of a foundational decisions which you're talking about. I mean, if I'm reading or understanding what you're saying correctly, because for the longest time both Bhatkhande and Rajwade can easily be understood or dubbed as right-wing or as conservative or as Hindutva, proto-Hindutva ideologues and so on. But it's not at all useful to make sense of the rigor and the audacity and the ambition, as well as the risks which are involved in such an exercise. But now, say from the contemporary vantage point, because there is a certain conjuncture to which all of it belongs, be it Wagner, be it Rajwadi, be it Bhatkhande, so on and so forth. Something else happens after 1917 with October Revolution, and a new fiction emerges, which is not grounded within this imagination of a nation or a national community, and which goes by the name of internationalism. The name already existed in 19th century with international and such, but it acquires a certain reality and actuality. So, and we've talked about those sequences from October Revolution to May 68 and May 68 till the present, passing through the collapse of Soviet Union and so on. So now at this juncture, what does it mean to really think about, I mean, can we really now make a distinction between, say, these attempts, these rigorous axiomatic decisions and risks which were contemporaneous to that late 19th century conjuncture, are we still contemporary to them? That's, or what are the decisions which would really take into account the stakes of our times? I don't know if at all it is the right question to be brought in. I don't know. Yeah.
I'd actually like to think with him.
I kind of want to say something on a little different tangent, and that is something that you brought in very interesting, which not here from in the discussion from morning. That is a question of science, and it is very interesting that how we can speak of fiction of science or science of music, like at the same time, and which brings us to the triangulation that Shamik spoke about in the morning. And in that triangulation, I would just like to point out that the choice of the three terms is also a choice, that is politics, art, and philosophy. Right? And to that, you are adding that can myth before. But I would also like to say, can science be included? Like when for example, Deleuze will think of a triangulation, what is philosophy? He will skip politics. It will be art, philosophy, and science. And in that, he also has something, he has one particular way to describe three as what affect is, you would say, to art, and concept is to philosophy. The function is to take something and transform it to, like, take a number and make it a different number. Like that. Take, if systematization is to be spoken of as a function, to take the music that is already exists, put it and transform it to what you would call the national myth or whatsoever. So, I think one interesting thing, therefore, to be thought about is that how the way nations produced. When we speak of it in scientific terms, it will be, of course, although it is happening in music, but is it scientific production of nation, or is it aesthetic production of nation? They are going to be like different directions, or even philosophical production, whether nation works as a concept, or does it work as a function, or is it just an effect? In the same sense, Shamik spoke of that images which directly affect us. So I just wanted to add that.
Wait, I'm not very clear what you want me to do. Seriously. Okay, I generally take a little more time to, so I'm not posing really any direct question as such.
You're not supposed to pose questions to me.
Oh,
I opened it up.
Okay, then I'll just
I have a question for Anubhav, but I'll ask.
Okay, yeah. So the theme, like I'll just looking at it. So aestheticization, politics, and the autonomy of the aesthetic process. I was just interested toward the end of it, like what I didn't really talk about in much detail. Like, can you think of art of politics? And what I was trying to think, I know it is not aestheticization, but I'm just sort of finding the context of what I discussed. Like, can you think of art of politics and what's really the stake if you do that? It is precisely because why I'm saying, with little bit of whatever exposure I had during my stay in JNU and later during my field work, with an organization. Like, increasingly what I feel, what I felt is this: the politics is more of an art. Art in the sense is something everybody would have their own personal trajectory, own biographical trajectory. And on the other hand, the deal is that how can you relate? Like if you are going and talking to somebody and you are trying to mobilize somebody, and how you are going to go and talk. Are you going to talk about dialectical materialism? Are you going to talk about the larger questions of related to communist history and so on and so forth? Or you are going to basically sort of address the very individual biographical trajectory and then sort of try to relate it to what is going on all around. So that's something I was always very fascinated with. But now the question of science that has come, and I would like to sort of, because three of you also talked about it. But then how do you place science in our art of politics? I think that's also somewhere becomes very important for me. It's precisely because I believe in these kind of a politics, like the science kind of works like a limit condition. It's something is that where pure subjectivity running havoc, like within an organization or whatever, the way you want to think of it, that pure subjectivity is running havoc, and that's where you basically what you do, you bring an organization, sort of a science of an organization. So you will get to hear things like how do you work, like what is the party structure, what is the organizational structure, what is ECGB. So my interest in organization, when today I was talking about during my presentation, also comes there, like how you actually think of organization in between the art and the science. So how do you think like organization as a part of it? And and that is I think if I don't have much expertise in as such in a workshop like this, to be very frank. But if I was interested, like when Shomik basically called, and if I was interested, it's precisely because I also felt what I know Vibhuti said, and I felt I find it very interesting that how you put politics in the music, like instead of that's the idea that you put politics inside the music. And I somewhere believe, like in case of politics, I think somewhere that art needs to come in. Like you need to put the art little more seriously into inside the politics, like sort of giving it a not emotional, but like the kind of a thing I was trying to think through. Like instead of a mechanical engagement with reality, perhaps through a kind of a aesthetic engagement is not that bad idea. But at least from where I coming from and the kind of context from which I'm talking. But this is very quick thought. I need to think about it as well. I was not sure. On the other hand, yes, autonomy of aesthetic process. As I see, like there is a possibility of it, like at least Ritik Ghatak is thinking about it. That is there a possibility that in terms of how we are going to think, if we are going to think like what is the autonomy of aesthetic process. Now, if we take it that there is an autonomy, then I am very interested in the word between. Like between in a sense like what I talked about right now, that how aestheticization of politics may not be that bad an idea from my experience, not from a philosophically informed position. But on the other hand, like from my discussions today, if we take the autonomy of aesthetic process somewhere, the word between is important. And like I think that's where the decision comes in. Like if you are doing politics, like what is the decision? Are you going to aestheticize to what extent? And to what extent politics is science? Like that, what I was saying, that science is a limit condition, that let's not reduce everything, like within a communist politics, that has been the, how do I put it, that has been art poses a threat, art is a risk. If I can take the word, but not in as a concept. So art is a risk to always this communist movement. Art always has to be sort of framed. And that framing is always the science of communist politics, that it always has to serve the final ultimate positivist, which we also talked about. So that is how it happens. There I think the between is very interesting today, where I stand and the kind of a political trajectory I see. I think the decision will be very, very interesting. Like, are you going to say the autonomy of art and thereby have a productive relationship with politics as two separate practices? Or you kind of try to put it, because I don't believe communist activists are ever going to be able to do, because that requires a scientific approach and it's a very different science what I do, the science that communist activists actually talk about. So I don't believe that is they can go, and I think there the between thing these days I'm very, very interested, because I don't see. In fact, I was reading Sir's book also, and he has actually concluded very ruthlessly that there is no arrow coming from the left politics right now, and I do agree with that. And similarly, there is no scientific, there has not been a scientific development. I don't think after actually Chalmujandar wrote those documents, anybody has actually seriously written anything in terms of science, Marxist science in India. There, I am very interested in possibility of art. That how art as a separate process interacts with the political process instead of just being a servile to the science. Like that's something I'm these days very interested in.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question later, but taking off from the last comment you made, just for everyone to think that how about we say irreducibility then autonomy, and irreducibility of all the procedures, be it art, politics, science, love. And while saying irreducibility, we are not talking about isolation. Of course, there is betweenness, and, which is productive. But a betweenness which cannot be planned. I mean, I'm coming back to the word planned from your presentation, that a certain kind of a, I mean, when Sir was paraphrasing what you're saying, that there's a program, there's a plan, there's a discipline, and there is a poetic singularity. Insofar as organization as a problem is concerned, we can think about that. But if we are talking about them as distinct procedures, and here I think I would like to bring the word truth, because otherwise, if we just are thinking about art, philosophy, and politics without bringing in the question of truth, then I think the question of irreducibility can't be brought in. Because they are singular truths, singular and immanent, as Shauman was saying in his morning note. So how about bringing these two stakes within the question of art, philosophy, and politics? What are your thoughts on that? Singularity. And let me ask the question I was anyway going to ask to Anubhav, but open it to everyone. That in something called Can Change Be Thought, but you suggest that, like Foucault was thinking about episteme, he says maybe we can think about culture as an entangled constellation of these four truth procedures. So a more historicized way of thinking about culture, of course materialist nonetheless, but where we don't necessarily think about culture as a domain, as a separate domain, but culture as an entanglement of these four truth procedures. And I keep on having a running thread of discussion with a friend of mine about a certain Indian sequence of various truth procedures. So we know that for the longest time, till say in 20th century, till Mahan, the kind of axiomatic decision on equality, you do not find a precedent of that in Indian history. Right? So a certain political truth was blocked, certain associations were blocked. We know that for longest time, a rigorous scientific inquiry was frozen, right? But the other two procedures we find a great deal of flourish, be it art or love, and a coming together of them in bhakti or various traditions which think them together. So I was just proposing to him, because he has this argument that the different cultures are irreducible ensembles. There's something distinct about specific cultures, and the hypothesis he was coming up with that we don't have visual. Visual is something which is not a part of Indian culture. We have music, we have poetry, we're masters in that, but not in visual. I was initially mistaking it as an organicist argument, that he's talking about that different culture specializes in different procedures or different inventions. No, it's not that it is autochtonously connected to a land or a people in a genetic sense or any of that. I think can be understood as a specific constellation. And then another hypothesis emerges that, see, exactly at what point in the Western history you have a complete a new visual sensibility, so to say, emerges. So around the time when new political sequences emerge. So 19th and 20th century, and especially if you look at the interwar period, a great example of that new visual sensibility, particularly in painting in the interwar period. So then, of course, there is a certain interrelationship between these two procedures. That a breakthrough in one, an inauguration of new sequence or new infinite of infinite truths are related to each other. So would it be a productive way of thinking culture as a specific entanglement of these? And how they impinge upon each other? Because that's an open-ended question, as Vaibhav mentions in that interview, that is something to be studied, that how are they interrelated? And the other open-ended question which Anubhav was talking about, that what is the affective correlate of certain political decisions? Yeah. That how do we think the affective dimension of political commitment, solidarity, marching together, staying together, irrespective of odds, yet remain self-critical, yet remain held in a very tight.
Just to let's say, very actually put better than me. I was kind of yeah, exactly. Mine somewhere. I think this particular politics, wherever like we are located right now, I somewhere feel, and I'm coming from politics, of course, with my own concerns and so on and so forth. Like when I believe it is sometimes reactionary. Which we actually sometimes perhaps we need to make a distinction between you reacting to something with a lot of passion, and I think there is a difference between affect, and I really like the fact that of a question of collective, the sort of a sense of a collective that not necessarily bound by an organization, but different ways of relating. I think that is where I was also coming when I was saying that the art of politics, that basically what kind of an affective and the science, both you can basically put together. Precisely because of the fact is something is, as I feel that within this politics, either the science has become a problem of organization. It is no longer a theoretical practice. Like, I don't believe such theoretical practice hasn't produced any new communist thought. There is no, as such, leader. Like Mao, we didn't really have a Mao. We didn't really have a Lenin, who is theory. And coming from that, I don't believe the theoretical purchase of it has worked. And I think that's the interesting point, that where, if that is the situation, if science is not going to come and rescue the revolution that hasn't happened, but at the same time stays as a hope, if it is a hope right now, like where both of you actually concluded that day, if it is a hope, then I see a very different kind of a art of politics is also required. Like you need to pay attention to it, that how to produce affect, which is not reaction. Like that's something, because I believe otherwise any sort of a radical politics is now tailing reaction. You are just there and you are responding to certain reaction. I think affect needs to be thought little different here.
To sort of play the devil's advocate there and to continue the conversation we were having in the break, is that what does it mean to produce? Who is producing? On to whom? Or the effects are something which are a result of subjecting oneself to something which has happened out there, something which is emerged. So, in a sense, it is affect or are the new emotions a result of that subjecting oneself, or rather the problem you're talking about, the subject without subjectivity without subject. So, in a sense, can we think about that subjectivity as a process, where the affect is not produced in a top-down sense by someone into someone, but something happens and then that produces new emotions. Now the question or the onus is upon the person or the individual is to decide whether to remain final to that, whether, as Sir says in the book, is whether to take that wound, so to say. So can we reframe this question? Because otherwise one would get locked up into the problem of production of affect in a sense of someone producing into someone. Because then who would produce the affect into those who are going to produce the affect into others? Then you enter into an infinite regress. There has to be some original poet who then produces affect, who then transfers it, and so on and so forth. I'm just putting it very crudely, but yeah.
No, I got it. Yeah, I don't disagree. That's
Yeah. So even the earlier questions which I was asking about truth and culture, anything you want to take? Yeah.
No, in the discussion on Wagner and Hindustani music, yesterday I brought Netflix. Today I will brought Twitter and social media, because they are also vehicles are producing affect in today's world. And it is not, it's not that politics is not appropriating affect so much today. It is one case to already have the goal set and program set, and just to find various means through which it can be effectuated, and then think of affect, as many are doing. But I think a more interesting question is that of singular truth that Vaibhav brought. In fact, more interesting is singularity, where it might not be truth. Like a false singularity might be a more powerful idea than a general truth. General in the sense that conventionally held, and false in the sense that against that backdrop it might not look like singular. And in that sense, I also wonder, yes, of course one can speak of irreducibility of the space, but I also wonder whether when a singularity is achieved, whether one can speak of one can speak of three spaces together. That once a singularity is brought up, in art, is it also political singularity? Is it also, sort of philosophical singularity? Many people have, since I come from mathematics, many people have written in various ways about Einstein's equation A is equal to mc square. And it's a very complicated derivation relating again two different spheres of energy and mass. And many people have written that it could be the equation could be anything. Mathematical equations are generally very long. This equation, in its elegance, is very just a tiny equation. It is something very sublime. And this affect many people have described. So in the same sense that something coming from science might also carry over that can work as well as sublimes. That's because is equal to mc square. Is it possible to speak of it as a certain similarity? So I think that can be taken, taken it that can be a takeaway not just from yesterday's conversation, but one of the purpose of art to find similarities, and that can be a possible relationship between that would be my submission between in the triangulation that Shamik has proposed.
I think connects to what all of you were saying. In somewhere, I'm also trying to synthesize this entire thing. What Anubhav, for example, you were saying that this kind of putting art into politics, drawing from formulation. No, तो point is मुझे जो लगता है कि how do we understand these categories of art, of politics, is also something necessary in order to make a conclusive statement. I'm not saying your statement is conclusive, of course it's open-ended, but there is always a tendency of producing conclusive statements in these scenarios. Now, what seems to me, what seems is one might draw an implication of what you were saying is that there is a question of something like spontaneity and desire in art, and something like a formalizing rigor in the scientific understanding of politics, where one has to find an in-between this, where one has to, I might be wrong, but if one thinks if one speculates that is an implication of what you were saying, at least if we read it like that, then it somehow connects again to the problem of something like desire and something like law. In so far as that there is a formalization in the question of law, and there is something like desire which always informs the question of spontaneity, which always informs the question of affect. Now, the thing is that you are also saying that the point is that this kind of the kind of relationship that they might have with each other, and the political effects it might produce, the political implication of this relationship, say, between this. Although they are very different things, law and formalizing process, but just to keep it in a more general terms, that if one has to find a relationship between these two, and if that is in a sense the inherent problem of many of the things that we are saying, that at one hand we have a question of knowledge, a question of scientific knowledge in order to understand, say, the political domain, in order to understand the question of politics. But on the other hand, you have an existential desire for something which art, in that sense, becomes a image of, in that sense. So, my question, my question is, and it's also a sense of, I'm saying it in sense of as a problem, that is it that this relationship, do we work out this relationship in terms of the ideas of desire and the ideas of art, which are already, the ideas of desire and the ideas of law, or the ideas of knowledge and the ideas of desire that we already have named today. Not today, in the sense of our contemporary reality. Say, for example, something like, you are taking the name of the great revolutionary sequence. So any great revolutionary sequence will always have something like a desire for a new utopic, some kind of a world, but it will also try to formalize it at that sequence, at right after the revolution. It will try to formalize it, giving some kind of a disseminable knowledge which can be disseminated. So, but nevertheless, in the case of what you're saying, that it already has a name. No, it has the name of mouth. It has the name of language. So, is it that this do we have to now some way separate ourselves from these in order to find a new relation between this kind of formalizing tendency and a tendency of a desire, which is not a desire for something which is already there, a reproduction of or a kind of reimagining of the say Maoist sequence or Leninist sequence, but something like a new relationship which would, but a new relationship between these elements, but a relationship which is constituted by an inaugural decision to separate ourselves from this given economy.
See, first thing first, let's accept one thing. We already have an inaugural decision, and that is a decision from where you coming and I coming, and I believe that's separate. That's that we keep fighting over since 20. So that there is a decision, right? So there is a difference there, but okay, let me start. But before that, let me start very first. Spontaneity, no, I'm not looking in art in spontaneity. Okay, I was trying to avoid this particular that way. So I'm not doing spontaneity in art. I'm not putting desire versus knowledge. I think the problem for me, as usual, is consciousness. And my point is that whether you put derived consciousness, question of consciousness, the relationship between science or / knowledge and consciousness, or you are thinking of consciousness differently. Say I want to think of it differently, for example, right? And I'm fine with the way you mean new relation, I mean it differently, I know that, but let me take the word new relation. So one is that to think the relationship between knowledge and consciousness as the problem of politics, okay? On the other hand, that doesn't mean I'm talking about spontaneity on the other side of art. Rather, I am trying to say not to think art in terms of spontaneity, but also to think of the relationship between art and consciousness. Okay, what does it mean? And given by training, I'm a sociologist, right? So I have to let me talk in terms of it. So what do we exactly mean? The point is something even Ritika is saying, and it's true. It is just simple description. Most of the time, art in politics, okay, has always been a kind of an entertainment device. Before that, keep the people engaged, start the program. After that, public meeting will start, the big people will come, and this has been the model. And then you actually sing people's song, that is also still under the banner of science, that the proletariat culture is the culture. That is the basically scientific discovery. All I'm trying to say is that whether you can actually the triangulation, if I can change it, I was actually trying to stick to this terminology, that's why. For me, what is interested is the art, consciousness and science. Okay, if I can change actually for me, not even science, it would be knowledge rather. So knowledge and politics is the question, of course, the side that I am sort of trying to look into. So for me, that's important. For right now, at least today, that when I was presenting the paper, that because I don't have that faith anymore in knowledge, the manner in which the politics is happening. The consciousness is always related to knowledge, right? False A. And it's still people believe. I'm quite aware of that. And I think there Ritika is doing a different thing, and which I really kind of appreciated when I was doing my reading of Ritika. So that's that. But there was something towards the end. What was it? That name. Yeah. But that's reality, right? Politics of naming is the thing in today's world, right? Exactly. Right. Now you were saying that then we have to separate ourselves. And that also I agree. Even yesterday's aesthetic conversation also I agree. But what my thing is this, I don't know, and this when I don't take me wrong, because I don't know as yet properly what you have in mind when you are sort of talking about separation, and it was a tea conversation, so I'm not a. But my point is that I'm interested, once you separate that gap, what do you do with the gap? You know? Like I believe that's the interesting object of politics right now. Okay, you separate, but that is not good enough for me. Like don't mistake me by saying that it is passivity. That's a politics, and it's an independence. So I'm not misinterpreting it by saying that, but I am not making a simplification. But my point is that that needs to be object of politics. So now if you connect how you make it the object of politics, I don't believe it is anymore science. There needs to be a new relationship. That's my point.
No, but that's what I'm sorry. But if you are saying that it is an object of politics, this gap, this kind of, say, some kind of a disjunction, is already an object of politics, then you already have a category of politics in place.
No, see, you have to stick to. Are you talking about rupture or gap? But sorry, when you say separation, are you talking about separation or a rupture?
No, separation in the sense that insofar as you affirm that there is something like a rupture, in the sense say that I affirm the fact that, say, taking for example that is conversation that was in cinema, then I affirm, for example, I take a position that from say 89 onwards, 90 onwards, there has been a saturation of the earlier sequence of cinema and an emergence of a new sequence in cinema which we are not very sure about. But nevertheless, that there is a change, a transformation in the way cinema has been produced, say in the West. So now, the point is that where do we begin? Do we begin at the level of description that these are the cinemas and then these are the new changes? Or do we begin from the very fact that you affirm that there is a rupture first? No, and that rupture, in a sense, separates me from, say, the kind of cultural studies as understanding of cinema.
Basically, the only point I am rather saying that when you do that, the affirmation, like that you affirm that there is a rupture, your politics, has to take that affirmation also object of your politics. That's my point. Like you cannot, then you are looking for a beginning, then you will fall in the trap of a beginning as well, right?
No, but my politics starts from that moment.
But my point is that once it starts, then it needs to incorporate. It needs to have a particular relationship with your decision of affirmation. Your decision, exactly. And I'm saying, so now I'm talking. See, and now I'm talking in your terms. But I was talking in my terms. But I don't think logically I disagree much with it. But perhaps you start from this side, I start from that side, which you were talking about.
Sorry, interject.
No.
Interject and ask one question. Do you still equate politics with a certain hegemony? In a sense, producing effect. Is it a certain hegemonic project or a counter-hegemonic? But hegemony as a paradigm of politics.
No, not at all. For me,
in a Gramscian sense, not at all in a pejorative sense.
No.
Very serious sense.
No. I absolutely. I'm taking it that way. No, I don't. I don't in a sense is something is that then you fall directly into this idea, and which I agree with you somewhere. Which I agree when you were somewhere you were saying like they need to get into a logic of production and sort of logic of production and reproduction, and deal is something you will also fall in the same trap of that knowledge and consciousness relationship that I was trying to talk about. Like if you are thinking politics in terms of hegemony, but the way right now, like right now, what I can say is something. What I'm trying to talk about is something is that if you are I'm at least trying to think of something new. I'm interested in something new process. New process. Now, for me, it is consciousness. For you, it's affirmation, so on and so forth. So, yeah, but not in terms of hegemony. Not in terms of hegemony precisely because the moment you. That's why I'm trying to rethink the question of organization also. Because within the politics, the kind of a conceptual purchase of organization has been, like so much is being written about how to organize. Can you rethink it differently? You know, that's my lesson. But no, not.
I have a question for you, Vaibhav. You mentioned something about how, talking about tradition and the arts, how poetry and music already had a very distinct tradition, whereas the visual was missed. I don't know if it is your interpretation.
No. It is my friend's reading
Yes.
of yeah.
So I just wanted a clarification. Like, was your friend talking about a particular instance in visual history where he's equating visual with a very particular instance of one-point perspectivalism type of oil painting and something that initiated art history as such. Like a special emphasis on this elite art of realistic and very naturalistic kind of visual depiction. So I just wanted a clarification.
Okay.
Because if you talk about visuals, I mean the tradition of visuals, then you cannot say that there is no such clear tradition
Sure.
of
No, I
visual
agree
history.
with what you say. So
So
I don't
I just
entirely
want-
agree with what you say.
Yeah, so I was just thinking that maybe the kind of visual history or tradition your friend was talking about is exactly this kind of tradition that was started in the 19th century with the coming of Enlightenment and taking off from Renaissance and the kind of one-point perspective and the kind of visual overtures that were made then. So I was thinking, I just wanted a clarification that is the tradition that your friend is talking about.
No, actually, his interest in this question. He's not an art historian. He is a poet, and he's interested in visual art as a student on his own, not in any professional institutional sense. His interest in this question comes from a very different angle, which is a more contemporary situation that he sees around him, particularly in Pune, where he stays. This attempt to educate and sort of people to see things, in a sense to create a visual awareness. And he finds a certain problem in that project because he thinks that it is in a very colloquial language, he says, either you have it or you don't have it. You can't sort of inject it, so to say. This is a similar problem to the problem of consciousness. So he was not of the opinion that we may never have it. So of the opinion that some things you have, why don't you sort of focus upon that and play with it, rather than trying to sort of go towards something which is not there. I don't completely agree with that formulation. My whole point was, from whatever he was saying, I was proposing a hypothesis that then can we think about culture as an entanglement of various truth procedures. And so only in that context I brought it up. I mean, I do not, I think it's a very commoner's observation. It need not be taken as some sort of a very serious academic thing, but it has a certain intuitive force to it. I see, and which is why I keep engaging with that, because I think somewhere what he's trying to bring, and it's a certain anti-philosophic kind of a gesture or a counter-intuitive kind of a gesture, is that not everywhere you would find all the things. You would find sort of different configurations in different parts. His concern is why these kinds of different configurations exist, and I think that could be an interesting question to explore. Not in terms of lack as a negative thing, as some sort of a judgment. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I just want to go back to Vibhuti's brief but very precise statement on these two readings of Wagner and just draw out some of the possible consequences of the two readings. So you have one reading, Lakul Abad's reading, which is refers to Wagner as somebody who produces the locus for a kind of national mythology. And the mythology also produces, in turn, a totality called the nation, which in turn produces a metaphysics of totality itself for the 20th century, a paradigm. Yeah. Again, actualized in specific political practices of fascism, Nazism, and so on and so forth. Historically, this process is not found in Wagner himself. It is found in the history from Wagner up to Hitler, at least, in which Goebbels plays a part. But it all eventually seems to crystallize and eventually become rigid as a mythic model. But the interesting thing, and Lakulabath identifies that metaphysics through Wagner. The interesting thing is, it still is a kind of model, a kind of measure. And to that extent, any measure, any model has to be placed as a coherent, scientific frame or instrument vis-a-vis what it is measuring. So then the materiality of German nation, its own history, all its sequences, all the actual difficulties of constituting a German nation from the 18th to the 20th century are there. And then with something like Wagner, who is merely one contingent figure of art, but that contingent figure actually producing a kind of counter-revolutionary event eventually, culminating in the Nazi sequence, which is a long history, but apparently resulting in something which is absolutely fixed. But what is fixed is actually also a measure, and the moment you look at it as a measure, it becomes unfixed. Yeah? This is a very interesting sort of a reciprocal methodological directions in Lakulabath's, because he's a philosopher, he is actually through his philosophical operations also performing something which is a cultural demystification, an ideological demystification. That's on the one side. On the other side is, of course, Alabadiou, who is unfixing Wagner from that very measure, who is making Wagner within his own oeuvre into an inconsistent figure. And that's why the comic opera is so interesting. The example of the comic opera, which is what Rancière would call not a representative example, but a kind of non-representative example, an inconsistent example. Something which the myth of Wagner or the mythology of German nation will not be quite able to sufficiently absorb. And the very idea of comedy in that sense is something which a measure or a model or a myth is not able to quite absorb. But what is further interesting is that the very content of that opera, which I had forgotten, I remembered very sketchily, but when you presented that opera, I remembered how struck I was by the nature of that opera, the story of that opera, that it is not just a question of myth, it's actually a question of the logical mastery itself. Yeah? And it's a historical movement of two kinds of masteries. One is the mastery of the organic handicraft guild community, and then an idea of mastery which is the very fundamental inconsistency of modernity, of democracy. That in the very axiom of democracy there cannot be a master, and yet democracy is a kind of circulation of mastery. And that circulation's most appropriate logic comes from capital. So in a way, this handicraft mastery of the guild mastery of the musician, the master musician, is something which is anyway going to move into an inconsistent mastery with what is going to come after that. But in this opera that Wagner wrote and Badiou talks about, already in the idea of the master, intrinsically, this inconsistency which capitalism is going to mobilize as a manipulative act of extracting profit can be affirmed as a singular moment of something infinite. So this is the thing, and this is a kind of comic infinity that Walther, that guy who comes from nowhere, is someone inconsistent with mastery, but he's not inconsistent in a feudal system or in a guild system or in a capitalist system. He's inconsistent anyway. That, I think, is a fascinating kind of a position of this person who comes in a guild system, but he himself cannot be placed in a historical society entirely. You know? And that is affirmation. All affirmations, since we are also talking about affirmation, all affirmations are partly, they are not abstract, they don't happen in the sky, but they also don't belong. Affirmations don't quite belong to in the world where they are affirmed. They are in that sense exceptions. They are not merely, they are local, but they are not only local exceptions, they are not only cultural exceptions, they are universal exceptions. They are not exceptions only to feudal society or guild structures and then a different exception in capitalism. No. A true exception is an exception anyway. Not empirically, but as something which is a kind of experience of exception. So what I think Badiou is affirming in Wagner, and in that sense changing the paradigm from the cultural deconstructive demystification that Lafu Labat performs, is that he's affirming something universal, which is a philosophical universal. But the philosophical universal is not in philosophy, it's in art. You know? It's in music itself. In that sense, music is not anymore a function of producing, or it is not an instrument of producing national mythology. It becomes something which is its own exception. It moves out of its world. That, in that sense, it is German music, but not just as a simple characterization of something which is a specific kind of music. It is that Germany is also inconsistent with itself. Just like music in that instance in Wagner is inconsistent with the world of music, the world of the guild, where there's a master musician who is supposed to be at the top of the rung of apprentices. You know? So, what follows from these two models are actually, and this is historically something in Bhatkhande which you brought out in your thesis, are two kinds of teachings. Two kinds of, not formal didacticism, but the question of something which is the transmission of knowledge. Because that is the test of states of rationality. Insofar as science is actually something which has a certain kind of very specific conceptual link to essentially something like rationality. But rationality is not a property, it's not a substance. It is the only test of rationality is something like, and it's also something like a faith or a subjective thing, subjective decision, but a decision that it can be transmitted. Now, if you take the side of the model of the myths, or the myths as a model, then of course there's transmission. But we know what kind of transmission that is. That is transmission through ideology. Fascist ideology, Nazi ideology, eventually an ideology which becomes so overwhelming that it becomes something which is a kind of madness. Yeah? So, transmission is not a transmission of knowledge. It is a transmission of knowledge, but it eventually becomes such an ideological mask that that transmission is a kind of direct implantation of a kind of madness in the behavior and conduct of people who belong to the party but also to society. So that is the work of the myth. So there is transmission, but no one will say this has been transmitted. It is as if it is always there. They are the very embodiments of that so-called knowledge, and hence it's not knowledge. How can it be knowledge embodied in the saturated sense? Knowledge has to have an objectivity. No, here there's no objectivity. There's a complete fusion. But any demystification shows that actually there is transmission. But this transmission is so subtle and such an insinuation that it works as if it is absolutely organic and absolutely eternal or immemorial. It was always there. When it is working during the Nazi period. Once it's smashed, so it's like, you know, what Ambedkar says about majority, communal majority, as a kind of fascist majority. A fascist majority cannot be changed, it can only be destroyed. Yeah? So a fascist myth cannot be transformed, it can only be destroyed. So once it's destroyed, of course, suddenly it explodes into what it was. But when it's working like that. Yeah? On the other side, the Badiou, so here is the question of scientific teaching. Here, the question of teaching, and here the teaching of Wagner or teaching of the affirmation of art, is not science in the sense of a content. Because precisely the danger is, the moment you think of content, any content eventually rigidifies. It doesn't matter whether it's scientific or culture. It rigidifies and becomes like a substance, a metaphysics which is embodied in human bodies. Hence, all science is liable to also become myth. There is no surprise in that. Hence, the kind of teaching in Wagner that Badiou sees, or the possibility of teaching in Wagner that he sees, is a teaching which is the transmission of the specific exceptional experience. So it is not teaching through the oeuvre. It is not teaching through the entire Wagner story, which is the usual way of looking at Wagner. From his young revolutionary days to his last anti-Semite, proto-fascist days. No, look at Wagner through the experience of what is exceptional to Wagner himself. Yeah? So, and that is the teaching, which is the teaching of the exception, but the exception as not something which is accidental. The exception which precisely is, if you want, the moment of the very truth of that lane, truth of that subject. But it is something which is still subjective, it is still experience. It is not a content, because the moment it becomes a content, science can enter into the other kind of, tendency, which is the tendency of fetish, tendency of something totalitarian, fascistic, and all of those things, which are equally scientific as they are artistic. So there's no difference between aestheticization of politics and the making science of politics. It's the same thing at that level. But it is to be able to somehow make that exception, which is an experience, but something which has not the objectivity as knowledge as content, but the essential rational wager of any kind of knowledge, which is its transmissibility. Not transmissibility to an identity, not German music for German people. No, it is the other way around. It's when something like music is transmissible to anybody, that its exceptional German singularity can come out. Yeah? So it is not to transmit Indian music to Indian people. But it is when Bhatkhande, on the one hand, sets it up, he sets it up for Indian culture, for Indian students. But the moment it's students, then potentially it's anybody. Yeah? And when it's anybody, then we are open to the experience of a Walther. It doesn't matter. It can happen with Bhatkhande, like it happened with the Guildmaster. But it can only happen when the question of transmission is brought. Yeah? So I think this is very interesting to look at these two consequences of the two readings of Lakulabaf and Alibadiu in terms of a certain kind of teaching.
No, thank you, sir. And, I don't know, since you've mentioned this idea of mastery, I'm just curious to know, because Badiou also makes this difference between mastery and genius.
Yeah.
And he finally says that the destiny that art cannot be reduced to genius but mastery. So, would you how would you differentiate within the idea that you pose, or would there be any difference between the idea of the genius and the idea of mastery, the way you look at it?
Well, I've forgotten the argument of that book. I read it a long time back. It's only when you mentioned the Meistersinger opera that I remembered the story.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the argument. I have to, read the argument and discuss with you and work it out.
Yeah.
So that I can't immediately respond about what he's saying about mastery. But yes, of course, through Lacan, a very dense engagement with the question of mastery, particularly in relation to the three psychoanalytic discourses: the discourse of the master, the discourse of the hysteric, and the discourse of four discourses: a discourse of the university, and discourse of psychoanalysis. So in that sense, the discourse of something like truth. Now, so mastery, when we think of mastery in the sense of something which is in the light of science as universal address, there mastery does not. It's not that there is no mastery. So one of the commonsensical, empirical, but somewhat misleading ideas of democracy is that democracy is without mastery. That is, of course, patently untrue, because you have in democracy masters. You have power. So hegemony and all that is very much part of democracy. There is no democracy without hegemony. So, Claude Lefort, a very interesting political philosopher, spoke of the circulation of power, the circulation of an empty place of power. So there is a singular empty place of power, a kind of sovereign place, but it circulates. That's the difference. It is not as if democracy is without mastery, but the place of the master is a place which seems to circulate. So the difference is in the case of the guild, the example from the opera. In the case of the guild, master is someone whose function and whose identity belong to they coincide. So the one who embodies the function of mastery in terms of sheer accomplishment, position, training, and everything, the person is the same. In the case of something like the function of mastery in the circulation of power, the function and the individual can keep changing. Clearly, the political phenomenon of circulating mastery is only an epiphenomenon or only a manifestation of the actual circuit of power, which is money, which is capital. So in that sense, democracy and capital absolutely go together. Now, of course, you can always discuss the project of extracting some other kind of meaning of democracy from all of this. That is another discussion. But this logic of mastery is not absent from democracy. Is not absent from the structure of power. But with the very important qualification that power is not something which coincides with something like the individual sovereign, the individual ruler, the individual embodiment. However much in today's experience of our country, it is so oppressive, you might think that the one person seems to be actually the guy with power. But one way of being able to think of this as something to be resisted, or resistible rise of whoever in this case, is to say that it is still an empty place. He might be occupying it with such a violent insistence, but it's still an empty place as a structure. This wouldn't be true of the guild structure. Yeah, now comes genius. Now clearly, genius in art is something which has different kinds of correlates in terms of theories of genius. So Plato would speak of poetry as a kind of mania, as a kind of divine mania. Something which takes possession, something which is ecstatic. In that sense, belonging to a philosophy which is not a philosophy of the human subject, but something which is inhuman, non-human. Yeah? Art as something non. So genius would also be something like a kind of auto-affectivity. The genius is affected by himself or herself, but it's auto-heteroaffectivity. In the auto, there is a hetero, there is an other. The genius is a kind of other. Yeah? But actually, this idea of genius and other is, and that's why in democracy, so it is very clear that in a guild structure, in a kind of feudal society, the genius and the master will actually come in dramatic confrontation, like in this opera. It can be comic, it can be dramatic, it can be even, with a certain kind of tragedy. Though it's not tragic, because it is ultimately something which is inherently comic, because the master's heroism is already punctured by the fact that there is someone else. But it is very real that there is someone else. Yeah? Now, in the case of democracy, it is already built into the structure, no? Because when mastery is circulating, it is really contingent on who embodies it. It could be someone who is absolutely an unlikely candidate for this mastery. But it is already part of the structure. In a way, all prime ministers or unlikely prime ministers. Doesn't matter if it's Jawaharlal Nehru or it's the present one. Because that's inherent to the structure in a circulating theory of power. And to that extent, something like genius, something like the exceptional individual, has lost its exceptional its sharpness, its singularity. While in the other case, it is very much there as part of a kind of upsurge. So democracy is not that democracy is a humanist philosophy as opposed to something which is a philosophy of genius or philosophy of ecstasy or philosophy of shamanism or whatever, something non-human. It is that the human philosophy has now been made possible by its inherent dependence on something like a theory of the other. So this is the critique of Kant. Any kind of autonomy cannot be separated from something like heteronomy. But the difference is, now heteronomy is not the law of some god or some divine force. Heteronomy has entered autonomy. So if you think of autonomy, you're already in heteronomy. You cannot make these pure distinctions between heteronomy and autonomy. And yet, this is the serious thing, you cannot not speak of autonomy. How can you live in our times and not speak of autonomy? But that is it. We have to think of autonomy not merely as relative autonomy, but intrinsically, so to use the same word we were using yesterday, intrinsically impurified, an impure autonomy. A kind of a contradictory idea of heteronomous autonomy. And to that extent, no theory of genius exists anymore. There are geniuses, but no theory of genius. Kant was the last one who had a theory of genius. So yeah, that's my response.
So can we rephrase the we were earlier talking about irreducibility of each of these procedures and yet entangled. So is it the same thing, autonomous yet heteronomous, so impure essentially?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah, it's in a way the same thing. Because there is entanglement. Yeah. There is entanglement. Yeah.
And why?
Or you can put it in the other way, that something like the finite and the infinite now are impurified with each other. So the infinite does not rest with a transcendental body. Yeah. It's a radical immanence, but radical immanence is not only finitude. In fact, since all of us are talking about Oliver, that is the biggest move he makes, no?
Yeah.
And that's also his philosophical vigilance against a philosophy of finitude that is the dominant French philosophy or European philosophy after structuralism. And he takes a lonely path, but speaks of something which is not an ironic infinite, but a real infinite. But a real infinite which is not transcendental. So yeah, that is what I mean.
Yeah. And in fact, since we're talking about art, I think one of the first pieces of among the 15 pieces on contemporary art is that art is not an infinite descent into finite, but it is the invention of finite from within the infinite.
Absolutely. That's the whole point. That is the whole point. That in Badiut, that is what he is really gambled his whole philosophy on, but also demonstrated it as a mathematician very rigorously. That does not mean that there are no debates with him. There are several debates and several things going on, but that's his specificity.
This brought up so lucidly, this finite, infinite, finally moves to that only, the finite, infinite, that each art object, each work of art becomes something like a finite point, finite subject point, but kind of a differential finitude of something which is infinite, which is the truth, which is the infinity of truth. So to look at this as a configuration rather than, this is what I was trying to point, that against this kind of a French problem of looking at art as encounter. The individual artwork is an encounter where the artwork, in a sense, withdraws in order for you to express the gap between finitude and infinitude, you have a different idea. That it is not, that's the problem, I think. Okay, then how do you distinguish between something like an aesthetical, but the event and something like the truth which is produced out of the event? So the truth which is produced out of the event would then be something which is in this entire configuration, an artistic. So I'm very interested in this artistic configuration, and these artistic configurations which propose some kind of a possibility. Say the artistic configuration in cinema, which is a kind of a modern artistic configuration, and we see, is it that this artistic configuration is saturating with the new advent of, but that doesn't mean, of course, that it is gone, it is exhausted. But is it that these artistic configurations are saturated so that we need a new kind of a, think of a new kind of a configuration in, say, something like cinema?
Right.
So that, I think, is a very interesting.
And which, as you were suggesting, goes by the name of a nation, like a Romanian name or Iranian name or Thai name.
Yeah.
And so distinct singularities.
Sure. Again, I think we should be very careful not to think of the event as cause.
Yeah.
The event is not a cause of anything. There is no event apart from the retrospective drawing out of the consequence. So that's the very important distinction between Deleuze and Badiou. Deleuze is a philosopher of the event. Badiou is not. He's not a philosopher of the event.
That has to be left.
He's a philosopher of the subject.
Yeah.
So there is no event apart from the subjects.
Which,
But then that also means we only know of or talk of very few events, while actually you can speculate on countless events, but you can never know them. So in that sense, there is a speculative puzzle here, always. Event is a brief illumination, he says. And only few of them are through subjective procedures, have a certain transmissibility, a certain discursive manifestation. Yeah. Configuration, in other words, the configuration, sequence. But in no way should we think that the sequence is something which coincides with a history of, with reality, something like reality.
yeah. And that's what you were saying. It's a decision you make, and then it's not an empirical sort of.
So an event is the only concept in which something like nothingness plays a part. Because all concepts scientifically, technically should be built on predicates, on definitions of what it is about, what are the essential predicates. Event has no predicate apart from itself and something like nothingness, void. Inconsistency, something which is based on nothing. Yeah? So this is very different from what Sayeed has been so lucidly talking about, which is in what his philosophy so beautifully brought out as specific modes of incorporeal transformations in art, in science, and in now. No, not what is the third thing? Sayeed? Philosophy itself, of course. Yeah.
So then event would be more of an encounter.
Event is an encounter. So just what Shomik said.
Yeah.
In each case, it's an encounter, of different kinds. So the functor and the affect and each of these are the concepts and the features of each of the kinds of encounters. So there we have a philosophy of the event. Event itself is, in a sense, the center of thought. In Badiou, it is very difficult to talk of event apart from the sequences, the configurations. But of course, it's also very delicate because event is not a mystical thing. The event is not irrational, or the event is not merely to be affirmed irrationally. So that's the biggest criticism that is made of Badiou. The other day, Shomik was telling me Zizek has made the same criticism. It's like Zen, something Zen, or more clear kind of he's kind of crypto Catholic. Yeah, something like he's basically talking of grace and miracle and stuff like that. But from his side, he's saying, no, it's not that. Absolutely not. He's someone who's talking of something which can be thought, but thought in a particular way. So it's very, very delicate, this whole thing. In Vidaras, you have so much more production about event.
In fact, what Anubhav was earlier talking about, this whole thing of subjectivity without subject, is exactly the problem he takes up.
It's very close to it, that's
Yeah,
what.
yeah.
This consciousness without any kind of
Watching.
subject. Yeah. This is a very interesting way of putting it.
Yeah.
Conscious. So, I mean, I have since you mentioned Partha Chatterjee, there's one article in my book that I referred to, which I find very interesting in Partha Chatterjee, when he wrote this reply to Vivek Chhabra. Yeah. And now in that he's talking of, one of the usual and correct objections to this everyday life of peasants kind of work that they have done, and expressing it in a slightly anachronistic philosophical terms of talking of peasant consciousness. So Gayatri Spivak had brought this anachronistic language out in a criticism, or not criticism, a discussion of Ranajit Guha very early. So again the same point comes, that peasant consciousness, how can there be a peasant consciousness? Because it's heterogeneous. Peasants are actually doing things which are against their own interests and against each other's interests in everyday life. And so many stories. And Vivek Chhabra also makes that criticism. So there is something which is really wrong about this thesis. So in Partha Chatterjee's rebuttal, he actually brings up something very sharp, very precise. He says that, no, of course we are not saying, or he is not saying, that there is something like peasant consciousness as a block, as something substantive. Of course not. This whole thing is heterogeneous. Everyday life is heterogeneous. It's contradictory. Everyone is acting against everyone else. There's nothing like a proper consciousness. But yes, during the peasant revolts, something happens and peasants act in such a way that it is as if they are acting as something like a subject. Now, of course, again the revolt finishes and they go back to a kind of fragmented life. So what happens is, effectively, this consciousness is not a consciousness in the sense of a subject who possesses consciousness. But consciousness is something exterior. Consciousness is history. Consciousness is what I'm calling event. Yeah, but it's great to use, so at that level it's not a problem to use the term consciousness. If we radically change its philosophical valorization in phenomenology and a certain subjectivism. So to that extent, I think what you're trying out is very interesting. Very interesting. To talk in terms of consciousness and not make it a question of subjectivism, and rather a question of historical materiality. If I get it, I mean, I think I'm not misreading it.
No, definitely. Because of that, I face a lot of problems also. Because usually the problem is that you kind of talk about the subjectivity without a subject, and it's difficult to, at least in social sciences, either it's a phenomenological reading of it, it's much easier to sort of convince the other side. But yeah, definitely that's the project actually. Definitely.
Yeah.
So, thank you all, Vaibhav, Anubhav, Sayeed, Vibhuti. It's been great last 4 days. The screenings, the discussions, haven't had something, subject is such a acute point in these discussions. Subjectively, I haven't had these kind of discussions for a long time in a public. So, thank you everybody, and yeah, let's have some tea.